Hello, I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's economics editor, and today I'm delighted to welcome you to a special bonus edition of Reality Check. Now, the Chancellor, in the run-up to the budget that's, of course, happening in a day or so's time, has been repeatedly making this claim that the reason why she's potentially going to have to hike taxes so much is because she's in a never-before-seen situation. COVID, the war in Ukraine, energy prices mean that our fiscal position is worse than it's ever been before. Now, normally on the show, we use graphs and stats to check these claims. But today, we're going to use facts, and specifically, we're going to use history. And to do that, I'm delighted to be joined by the Spectator's history buff and also our deputy political editor, James Heale. James, thanks for joining Reality Check. Now, there's a bit of an elephant in the room that we should just address straight off. Is why do we have a row of drinks in front of us?
Well, I know that if you're analysing the budget, Michael, you might be considering drink at the current time, given the very tough fiscal medicine that is facing Rachel Reeves. But traditionally, the Chancellor Exchequer is the only person in the House of Commons who is allowed to have a drink only on budget day. And so we decided to honour that by having a range of budget tipples when it comes to budget day. And now, look, you haven't been able to smoke in the House of Commons since the 1690s. The tradition, we believe, of drinking at the budget comes from around the 1850s or thereabouts. And so the first one we could find, doing a bit of analysis and history research, is what Gladstone and Disraeli drank in the 1850s. So we're going to have a few of those and work our way through to the present day.
And what we thought, what we're hoping to put the spotlight on you, James, is to sort of, as we go through various different chancellors and, of course, try their drinks, we're going to try and answer the question, is Reeves really in the most difficult question that a chancellor has ever been in? Is history actually that unique? So we'll get started, first off, with Benjamin Disraeli, as you mentioned, the first one we find records of a drink for. And his drink was brandy and water. So if you'd like to take a sip, and then perhaps tell us a bit about Disraeli's budget.
I certainly will. A sort of slightly watered down version. I'll tell you in a sec. So, see, look, that is a very nice drink to sip because it enables you to have... it keeps you sort of alive and so warm, but also it's a slightly diluted. And of course, the reason why Disraeli would have wanted a drink like that was because he gave the longest ever budget speak on record, which was 1852, 5 hours. But there was an interval, like a sort of West End show. And much of the debates that happened between him and Gladstone across the dispatch box were concerning the kind of post-repeal of the Corn Laws from 1846 onwards. And that would have been something about sort of taxation. And back in those days, speeches were a lot longer. They were sort of talking more general principles, kind of theses that animated the Liberals and the Conservatives. You have to remember, back then, of course, it would have been much more an elite audience you're appealing to. This is before the Second Great Reform Act in 1867. So this is much more appealing to a kind of educated kind of crowd who are very much paying those taxes. So hence why you have a sort of brandy and water, which is something that would enable him to sort of keep Disraeli going as Chancellor, while also ensuring that he was not too inebriated when delivering that speech.
Well, hopefully we'll keep us going through this podcast as well.
Yeah.
Reeves, I'll pass it back to you if you like some more.
I'll tell a bit more.
Reeves quite likes a long speech as well. Admittedly, not 4 hours, but she did drone on a little bit, I thought, at the spring statement. But are there any other similarities between Disraeli and Reeves, would you say?
Well, it was said that, I think it was Disraeli sort of drunk on the exuberance of his verbosity. I'm not sure necessarily you could accuse Rachel Reeves of that, but she is someone with a mind for history. Because one of the big things she was really proud of, Michael, was of coming in. We're going to get later to him, the great Nigel Lawson, former editor of The Spectator. But she took down the picture of Nigel Lawson that Rishi Sunak put up in number 11 and took it and replaced it with Ellen Wilkinson. Ellen Wilkinson, of course, was the education secretary in that great Clement Attlee government of the mid-1940s, also, incidentally, the co-founder of the Communist Party of the country. And so, I mean, wags might see something in that. But she is someone who appreciates the kind of context of all this, which is why it was such a disappointment when we revealed on the Spectator steer-pipe column that she will not be drinking this budget or the last one.
So let's move on now to our next one, which is from William Gladstone. I'll admit, this is one I'm slightly worried about. This is sherry and a beaten egg. Before you have a sip, we should say this is the Spectator's interpretation of sherry and a beaten egg. I think we've potentially used a sweet sherry when maybe we should have used a dry one. But have a sip if you're brave.
I will. Well, certainly there was no greater sort of self-flagellator of British politics than the great William Gladstone. No man has given more budgets than him, 12 budgets. And he was very famous for priding himself on his intellect. And he and Disraeli were the two great figures, the lion and the unicorn, who defined British politics from the 1840s to the 1880s, really. And so very much looking forward to this one, which is always the one that sort of, when I do an annual tweet about the different ones, is
everyone gets excited.
Absolutely. Here it goes.
You're a brave man.
It's like Hot Wings, but for the budget.
Exactly.
Okay, it's like a slightly thick Irish coffee.
Okay.
It's sort of with more cream, I'd say.
Yeah.
I'm keen for you to try that.
Yeah, let's give it a go.
Let me say that what was interesting about that period, of course, is that I do think there are echoes with today. Go on.
Oh. I think I got quite a... Apologies, viewers and listeners. I got quite a sort of hit of egg white there. But underneath the egg white, you're right. It's actually quite nice. It's sort of like a Bailey's. I think we probably could have frothed the egg white a bit better.
One for the producers next time. But what was interesting is that they promised always to sort of abolish income tax, which was one of the big sort of talking points that period. And of course, they never do. And there was always things that get in the way. And it's sort of Macbeth style tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, which in Reeves' terminology has become, to quote Thatcher, Macbeth with a heavy cold, to borrow, to borrow, to borrow. And so they always promise to get rid of income tax, never actually do. And of course, income tax is with us to this day. But having a taste of that, you can imagine when Gladstone did get the record for the longest continued budget in 1853, that was 4 hours and 45 minutes. So I'm not surprised the grand old man would have wanted something like that.
Well, we drink quickly here, as I say. So we'll move on to George Goschen now, and port, which I think will be a bit more pleasant. As you're sipping...
A more familiar drink for me.
As you're sipping this one, I wonder if you could think about all the chancellors in general. We've been saying, in our reporting, we said in the magazine last week that no budget has leaked, been pitch rolled as much as this one. But is that true? Where chancellors of time gone by talking to the press as much as this one seems to?
I'm going to get on to that when it comes to Hugh Dalton, who I believe was the last Etonian to be Chancellor Exchequer for Labour, certainly. But Goschen, I mean, the favourite quip about him and his time in the Exchequer was Lord Randolph Churchill, father of Winston Churchill, when he resigned. He said he famously forgotten Goschen. And that basically was what happened, which is that, the whole thing about the politics of the 1880s, he didn't realise that Goschen was going to be there to take this place as Chancellor Exchequer. And of course, that was a great pride for Winston Churchill, who we'll come on to, was that he got to wear his father's robes as Chancellor Exchequer. But Goschen liked his port. And I think that's actually probably my favourite drink so far. Although I wonder, I have to say, Michael, drinking that with a budget, I mean, it might send you to sleep a little bit. I do think the brandy and water is probably the best thus far.
I think
keeps you on your toes,
Exactly. I think I would worry delivering a budget after that. But you mentioned Churchill, so let's jump into it. And I'm going to say that Churchill is the non-woke version of Disraeli, because Disraeli had brandy and water, but you've got Churchill's drink there, which is brandy with no water.
Well, look, they both talked about sort of various themes of Tory democracy, which is something that Winston Churchill's father Randolph championed. Famously, of course, when Winston was offered the job of Chancellor, he thought it meant the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster by Stanley Baldwin, so he was shocked by that. That was one of some of the highlights from his time at the Treasury in the 1920s, between 1924 and 29. Two moments really stand out for me. I mean, one of which is the amusing anecdote, which is him on the tube. The only time he ever got the line, unlike the Darkest Hour, number they may tell you, is that he got on the tube once, and that was to get on the Circle line. Unfortunately, he went around 2.5 hours and had to be rescued from that because he kept going round and round in circles. The other thing, of course, most famously, more importantly, was the 1925 meeting he had with the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, in which he sort of gathers him and Keynes, and they have a long dinner in which they discuss about Britain should return to the gold standards or not, and we do. And some would argue that we have been living with the repercussions that ever since.
That's where it all went wrong,
absolutely.
You might say.
100 years ago, we should have tasted that. Right, here we go.
It's a good drink, brandy.
It's a good drink. By this point, of course, Churchill has been an MP for 25 years on and off, lost his seat several times. I mean, the famous one, of course, being Dundee, where he sort of leaves there without office, without a seat, and without an appendix when he's had appendicitis there. And he loses, of course, ironically, Michael, to the only teetotaler ever elected to the House of Commons, Edwin Scrimmager. And so I think that might be a nice
The only teetotaler ever elected.
The only prohibitionist, yeah.
The only
1922.
prohibitionist.
Forgive me, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there've been other teetotalers.
I was going to say, there's probably a few in your party.
That's a reality check. Yeah,
you've just been
For
reality
me,
checked.
I've just been reality checked. Sorry, forgive me. Prohibitionist, never been elected under that ticket.
So the next drink, as we approach the middle, I'll admit is the one I'm most scared of because I think I might be a little bit lactose intolerant. This is rum and milk of Hugh Dalton. Now, tell me about Hugh Dalton, because my only knowledge of him is that he was a freak because he drank rum and milk.
Well, other than being a freak, we talked about earlier about budget secrets. He is the most infamous example of budget secrets leaking. And all I can say is Hugh Dalton was born 70 years too early because, of course, Michael, he was the one who was walking through, about to deliver his 1947 budget, and he bumps into a Star reporter. This is not the sort of Daily Star that we know and love, but the Star at the time. And he sort of tells him a few things that are going to appear in the budget. And as he goes up to speak, it turns out the copy is filed, and as a result of this, he has to resign over that budget because he's leaked budget secrets. One wonders what the sort of Treasury team and the number 11 press officers will make of all that now, but he has to resign over that, and was one of the so-called Labour Big Five out that 1945 to the 1947 Labour government.
Well, while you take your sip, which I see you're putting off, well, actually, let's get your reaction to it first.
I mean, it's just milk. I'm not sure you're... Is that rum?
We get there's rum in there. Yeah.
I'm not... It's just milk.
Let me have a go. This could end the podcast fairly quickly, but no, I can either taste brandy from the last one, or there is a bit of rum in there.
There is a little. I mean, this is the thing. A Chancellor. They've always said you can have an alcoholic drink. I'm never really sure they've specified how many alcoholic drinks.
I'm going to take some brandy just to make sure I got some alcohol there. Yeah.
Of course, Dalton resigns. He's then replaced by Sir Stafford Cripps, who, despite his austerity, George Osborne could learn a thing or two, was wildly popular. He was a very austere figure. Of course, suspended previously from the Labour Party. One that for Keir Starmer to take a note of. And he becomes Chancellor in 1947, and then he keeps the office until shortly before the end of the Labour government. He's dying from the physical burdens, really, of that wartime and post-war era, and he is replaced by Hugh Gaitskell.
Well, before we get there, I want to ask a couple of questions about Reeves and Dalton, because you mentioned that he had to resign because he leaked budget secrets. Now, the Tories and the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, are trying to push a similar line that, so much has leaked from this budget. It's caused uncertainty. There should be consequences. Do you think we're at all in a similar situation? Question one. And two, Reeves and the government are completely denying that, the Treasury are giving information out to journalists. But anyone who reads our coverage or, say, the Financial Times would see that's not true. I mean, don't tell me who your sources are, but the Treasury are speaking to journalists, aren't they?
Well, look, I mean, I think on the second point, to be fair to the Treasury, people will come to them with stories. And of course, you've got to remember that the economic infrastructure of this government is very much changed from the 1940s when you could have a handful of officials doing stuff. You've now got the OBR involved. You've also got different sort of watchdogs, etc. You've got the FCA potentially on some different things. And so it's much harder. So if a journalist comes to them with a story, I mean, they've got to give a comment, also hose it down. I do think, though, that yes, I mean, it's quite interesting now that we've had on this week's cover people questioning the future of the budget. And I think that shows that the old days when we had central bank government control from the 1940s up until the 1990s. All that kind of world has changed. We're much more dependent on sort of the fluctuations of the currency. And of course, as I always say to you, Michael, when we go and podcast together, the UK is dependent on the kindness of strangers. We are very much more exposed. And I think that, for all the railing against the bond markets and other magazines which may appear out this week, actually, we have enabled, through many successive chancellors and governments, to be in this position ourselves. So I think that, look, in terms of the second point about, we've got to deal with the world as it is. I also think that there's much more a sense of awareness to market fluctuations. And we saw perhaps the downside to that when we saw the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, at our local pub to chairman after the mini-budget. And of course, we saw the fluctuation of the spikes, etc., as a result of that. And then on the first point, I do think that, there is very much less a sense of taboo around leaking of government secrets. Now, as a journalist, of course...
Well, we are not complaining. No, I say the more leaks, the better.
Absolutely, if it's in our interest. If it's from a rival publication, then that's their fault. But I think that we are in a very different world right now. And one wonders, for instance, to give a very sort of pro-Labour view on this podcast, if Clement Attlee was in Keir Starmer's shoes right now, would he be respected as someone who famously said very little and sort of would dismiss a minister by saying, not up to it? Poof, pithy. I mean, these days they get called into the Labour whips for being woke as anything.
Yeah. Well, talking of woke, let's move on to what I think is probably the only non-water, but the only non-water drink that's also pathetic, and that's because it's rum spiked orange juice, which was the drink of choice of Hugh Gaitskell.
It was, yes, rum spiked orange juice. And of course, he becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer, famously with his budget introducing prescription charges after the introduction of the NHS in 1948, causes the resignation of Nye Bevan and the Great Labour Civil War of the 1950s, described as a desiccated calculating machine. I'm curious to see what that machine drinks. So here we go. Let's try a bit.
I think it might be Spectator spiked, so maybe more spiked than he.
I mean, I'm not sure if we're doing our spikings right at the Spectator, but that's jolly tasty. I mean, that's just Tropicana. Try a bit of that.
Ooh.
I mean, to be clear as well, by the way, you are giving perhaps 2-hour-long speeches.
Yeah.
You do not want to be hammered at the dispatch box, to be clear, when we're talking about this. And there are, I mean, of course, the famous occasion of someone being drunk at the dispatch box.
Yes. Did anyone actually end up getting drunk while they're delivering this speech?
The famous occasion in fairly recent times, Michael, is Alan Clarke, who was accused of by Claire Short at the dispatch box of effectively being drunk, and he then later admitted in his diaries he was after a long wine tasting lunch in the mid-80s. But I mean, that's the thing, you have to be able to kind of keep your and it
is
your
very
feet.
refreshing,
It is.
as you say. It's a good,
it is.
good
And
choice.
different politicians I've spoken to or heard accounts about, some of them will say they want a bit of a spike to keep them, pumped up, etc. But others, for instance, Enoch Powell famously said that he would never go to the toilet before a big occasion because he wanted a urine full bladder full to keep all the sort of everything on edge, really sort of tense
keep the
and tight.
adrenaline going.
Absolutely. So it depends on how you sort of get your mojo, as it were.
And how's your mojo? We're about halfway through. Can we get a James Heale drunk check?
I'm fairly consistent, actually. We've only had a sip of each.
Yeah, I'm finally starting to relax. I feel like I'm at the stage of a first date where like this might go well.
Well, I've had worse podcasts, I'll say that. No, I think they're all fine. I think that it does show the changing taste as well. Of course, you remember we're buying modern products, so all the different sort of different complications, etc., factors would have changed with all that. But I do think my favourite thus far is either the Goschen Port. But equally, I appreciate that's for a long evening. We're recording this later on the night. But I also think the brandy and water goes well. But
I like the beaten egg if we hadn't put the egg white in. I think it was like yolk, maybe. But let's move on to Dennis Healey. And we've gone full circle because we're now back to brandy and water.
Brandy and water, yes. And of course, the 1970s were pretty grim times. And of course, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, famous quote. And there was a lot of speculation this year that Rachel Reeves was going to be the first Chancellor to raise the basic rate of income tax since 1955. Following year, of course, Dennis Healey, who was that Chancellor, had to go to the IMF for the infamous 1976 moment, the bailout. And then there was also the incredible speech by Jim Callaghan where he says, he talks to the Labour conference and he says that, insofar as an option existed, it was only by effectively pumping more money into the economy. And so there was a real sense of a big moment happening. We talk about kind of big crunch moments in the post-war consensus. That was probably one of them. But Dennis Healey, a remarkable man, a really great set of memoirs and a proper hinterland. But his treasury is often characterised as someone who made the pip squeak. But what's interesting, I think, now, Michael, is we see a kind of echo between the current Labour government and the current Labour Parliamentary Party and some of the echoes of old, New Labour and old, which is that actually I think they're much more kind of some of them a bit sceptical to the city. I've heard comments from Labour MPs saying
it feels like we're in a more old Labour era.
Yeah, that sense of the money markets.
There was the famous quote. Let's make it famous. The quote that a backbench Labour MP made when they were U-turning on the disability benefits cuts, and they said an MP was overheard saying, it was just £5 billion. Why does that matter?
Yeah.
Which feels like a very old Labour.
Well, it's the Reagan line as well. It's like a billion here, billion there, so it adds up to real money. But also it's the Andy Burnham thing, which she said explicitly in an interview, which was, we can't be a hock to the bond markets. And actually, well, you can.
Yeah. But you hinted at them earlier. Let's explicitly name them whilst I have a sip.
Yeah.
I say again, brandy is just a lovely drink. But, look, the New Statesman this week have discovered the bond markets. They've called them the bond vigilantes. But at the same time that I'm suggesting to you that Labour is going back to old Labour, the fact that their House magazine has done a cover story saying, actually, we need to worry about the people who keep this country afloat, the people who who buy our debt. Does that suggest that maybe the left are actually waking up to the idea of fiscal conservatism?
A couple of things are going on. And one of it is quite a sexy subject, isn't it? You know, sort of vigilantes, you know.
I think you might be the first person to say sexy in the context of the bond market, but you have had 6 or 7 drinks.
It's an interesting subject, right? You know, and sort of having a kind of villain always helps go, those are the guys. But of course, you have to realise that it's like sort of railing against Isaac Newton for the laws of gravity. Yeah. And actually, these things exist. And as I say, you know, if I take a load of money out and gamble a house on X and it turns to be Y, and the bailiffs come round, I do think that is a self-defeating mechanism. And I think keeping that credibility ought to be aware. And I think that was so interesting about one of the big moments this year when we were doing our parliamentarian wars, Michael, and sort of judging it. What's happened in the House of Commons? And of course, it's been the sister dying. But for me, the big visual moment was those tears by Rachel Reeves. And of course, the bond market's reacted.
It's the moment of the year, right?
Yeah, of course. And it reacted really badly to that, thought that she was going to be sacked. So I'll be interested to see when we talk about political difficulties, about Keir Starmer and his Parliamentary Labour Party colleagues, what happens to Rachel Reeves and whether the bond markets react badly to that.
Well, let's hope she doesn't cry next week, and let's hope that we're not crying after the next few drinks. But the next one is quite a pleasant one. It's Geoffrey Howe's drink, and it's a gin and tonic. It looks like a glass of water there, but tell us if we have actually put gin in that.
So Geoffrey Howe, really interesting, one of the sort of great figures of the final third of the 20th century who doesn't have a biography about him. Welsh. A sort of Welsh romanticism to his soul, which has not really been picked up. He named his dog Budget, and he was Chancellor.
Did he?
Yeah, he was from
amazing.
1979 to 93. Then becomes Foreign Secretary. Of course, later, the infamous assassin, in some people's words, Mrs. Thatcher. But he was the person who sort of went with perhaps the most famous second-year budget, which was 1981, which has, of course, led to the 364 economists saying that he needs to change tack. One of them being, of course, Mervyn King, who later became governor of the Bank of England, to which Howe had the famous line, "An economist knows 364 ways of making love, but doesn't know any women." And that sort of summed up, I think, what Howe's approach was, which was defying conventional economic orthodoxy at the time. But here we go. Yeah, so a simple gin and tonic, ironically.
What is there to be said about a gin and tonic? I mean...
That's quite a strong gin and tonic. I'm not.
Well, it is the Spectator. It is reality check. We don't normally do rum spiked orange juice.
Cool, but that is the most. I think that's the strongest drink I've had for perhaps the dullest man of all. Of course, Dennis Healey, we've just drunk from, previously said, you know, it was like being savaged by a dead sheep, comparing an attack by Geoffrey Howe. So yeah, quite an important chancellor. One who maybe doesn't get the credit in the annals of history he maybe deserves.
Well, let's move on to a Spectator man. This is, of course, Nigel Lawson. So tell us about Nigel's move from the Spectator and, of course, what then famously happened to the country's economy. But also, this is wine and Malvern water. And I might be giving away my class here, but what the hell is Malvern water?
Just posh water, basically.
Okay.
Make it that way. Nigel Lawson was a really interesting figure because he understood the money markets. He also understood journalism, so he could speak in quite accessible but intelligent language.
Was he Reeves-like then? Was he leaking all the time?
No, he didn't need to. No, he had that authority. There is an arrogance, a bit like an Eric Cantona of sort of British politics, where he didn't need to sort of do it in that way because he had the confidence, because he could speak the language of kind of the financial journalists, the financiers, and also Tory MPs too. So he was the Spectator editor, sacked, then seeking a seat in the early 1970s, gets elected in 1974, becomes the Energy Secretary in 1981, Chancellor Exchequer 83 to 89, and it was a really big part in getting the tax burden down and being part of that 1980s boom. At some points thought to be a future successor to Margaret Thatcher, never really wanted it. A bit of Ed Balls in that way. Some people have a top job in politics. For him, it was the Treasury in many ways. And I think that he is someone who many Tory politicians revere. And, you know, it's interesting, you know, Mel Stride, the current shadow chancellor, incidentally a man who has flirted with the idea of bringing back a budget tipple, really likes him. And, of course, one that Rishi Sunak put up. So I'm going to try his drink now. All this while he's bringing down taxes. And, of course, perhaps in some ways, one of the most infamous budgets of the post-war era as well, the 1988 budget, which dropped the top rate of tax down from 60% to 40%. And it was around that time people started to wonder, you know, has she gone too far, Mrs. Thatcher? And of course, 2 years later, she was out of office.
And it's interesting you say, obviously, about the...
Oh, that is very nice.
It's good. Do you think the water makes a difference? I was a bit confused why there's water in the wine.
It's very drinkable.
But I was going to say...
read his book, by the way, Michael, which is The View from Number 11. And The Memoirs of a Treasury Radical.
Well, and just this tidbit I was going to bring up about sort of his long shadow over today's Conservatives. I believe that there is a sort of Tory WhatsApp group chat about economic thinking, which the display photo, I'm told, is of Nigel Lawson. So as you say, he obviously looms large.
He also made the good sense, of course, to get involved with Tory politics after he left office in 1989, wrote a famous weight loss book as well, but was very much involved, for 35 years until his death. He was very much involved in things like the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the CPS, and cast a very, very long shadow, which I think always helps to build up your legacy.
Another drink now that's got water in it. This is whiskey and water. That's probably one of my favourite drinks, and this is, of course, Norman Lamont.
Norman Lamont, of course, was Chancellor from 1990 to 1993, had to go after Black Wednesday, then replaced by Ken Clarke. He was an interesting Chancellor. I mean, of course, the central moment for him was Black Wednesday, and of course, you watch footage of that time, and David Cameron, his young special advisor, was walking behind him. And really, Europe was the thing that sort of dominated him in a way which, in the 1980s, perhaps the early 1980s, it was the economy. And Lamont is someone who, I think, very much still alive, very much, again, an active Tory commentator on all these things, but is someone who was very close to John Major and then ended up falling out with him and became someone who lost his seat in 97 but was associated with the so-called bastards group of Eurosceptics. But yeah, here we go.
Do you think...
But also led, of course, the famous 1993 budget, which was the biggest tax-rating budget of recent times until, of course, last year's one with Rachel Reeves, which had about £38 billion worth of tax.
We might have to VAR. You didn't drink any of that. Oh, you're going for it now.
No, of course not.
I thought you were trying to chicken
one more
out.
Thing. No, you dare. Don't you dare.
I was like, I've seen these. I've seen these drinks before, but it's interesting you mention the fallout with John Major. What is your sort of read of the Chancellor's relationship with Keir Starmer? Are they heading for a fallout?
I don't think it's one of their personal choosing, but I equally think that she is incredibly popular. I spoke to one Labour wag the other day who said that it's nice to see the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in lockstep, referring to their personal ratings, which are, Keir Starmer is minus 66%, Rachel Reeves is minus 70%. And so they're both incredibly unpopular. But Reeves is the most, I believe by some metrics, someone in Ipsos told me this, the most unpopular mainstream figure.
Oh, she is.
Yeah, in British politics.
So.
Yeah. And so I think that...
do you think, is she going to be junked after this budget?
I don't think it'll necessarily be Keir Starmer dumping her, quasi-style, etc., or any great spectacular falling out.
Because as you say, the markets would...
Well, it's the markets, but also, but the point is that Keir Starmer doesn't have an independent economic policy, unlike, say, Thatcher and Lawson, when Thatcher had Alan Walters at the end, and of course led to the infamous advisers advise, ministers decide row of 1989. But it's just simply a matter of political expediency, and you try and, towards the end, you try and junk your Chancellor. The key thing, of course, Michael, is that, is Keir Starmer going to be there in 12 months' time? A lot of political journalists will tell you no. And so it all depends up after May. Maybe she'll go down with a ship. Maybe they can pull off an improbable comeback. I'm just not sure how many budgets Rachel Reeves will be delivering.
We're losing the water for our final alcoholic drink, which which is Ken Clarke, which is just straight whiskey, and he's the last Chancellor to drink at the dispatch box. Why did it stop?
Well, the reason it stopped was because Gordon Brown came in 1987 and wanted to have Highland Spring water as his drink of choice. And actually, there's a great story still on the BBC News website from 1998 in which the sort of director of Highland Spring Water is so delighted that they are that he's done this and it's led to a boom in products, and they've been sort of plying the opposition with Highland Spring Water for years. But it was just Ken Clarke keeping up the tradition and very much deflecting his drink of choice. There's a wonderful clip from I think it was the late 1980s. Ken Clarke's my favourite health secretary for this reason, where he's asked at Ronnie Scott's, this is a late night jazz bar, what are you going to be drinking tonight? He said, probably an early one, 2 a.m. And he looks at his watch. And of course, that was very much his style, which is back in those days, you had the late night sittings of the House of Commons. And so the Health Secretary could go out 2, 3 in the morning, come back and only start late 11 in the morning or thereabouts. Ken Clarke was just also quite a flamboyant, didn't really care much. Later in his years during the coalition, he would go off without a mobile phone, go wandering around the British Museum, go bird watching. And I was told by one senior source that actually there were times in the 1990s when they didn't know, the Secret Service didn't know where the Chancellor of the Exchequer was because he'd gone wandering off looking for a rare bird or something like that. Wow. It's just very much his character. Yeah. Whereas Gordon Brown was much more austere, the son of the manse. So I suppose that was why. And after Brown was the last one we had economic growth in this country of more than 2%, the Lee Kuan Yew rule, etc. And it's always never really returned to that level. So here we go for Ken Clarke, the last time this country saw.
The last time.
And of course we had Tory spending plans.
Yeah, I mean, your Gordon Brown point slightly disproves it, but I would like to say that it was all downhill when
Brown,
they stopped drinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, stop drinking apart from Brown, but if you, Damien McBride's book, he talks about Brown basically hold a glass all evening. And so, whereas you or I, in the course of reception, might drink 3 drinks over 3 hours or maybe more, Brown would just have 1 drink and be sort of laser focused.
Well, why don't you keep hold of that? I will take the whiskey and water.
Before we get on to the very basic water, which Brown, Darling, Osborne, Hammond, Javid, Sunak. After Sunak, it is Zahawi, and then it's
there was free in a year at one point.
Kwarteng, Hunt, and Reeves have all had ever since.
Well, booze does not affect your political recollections. I will not force you to drink the water, although of course it is there. But what about our broader question? Is Reeves really in a sort of historically unique situation? She, as I said at the start of this episode, she constantly refers to things like Brexit, the pandemic, Ukraine, and she says, the world is changing. But surely all these drinks and all the chancellors they represent could say that they were in a unique time.
Yeah.
Is it just an excuse?
I think that a lot of the excuses are very commonplace, and we've seen some of the sort of rhymes and echoes throughout all of this, Michael. I do think, though, there is that question of, is it George Bush Senior, the vision thing? The vision thing. What's the vision? Yeah. And I was sat there in the Chancellor's briefing 2 weeks ago in that Tuesday morning press conference at 8:15. I started thinking, what is to stop you doing the exact same thing in 12 months' time? And it is the kind of question about the doom loop.
Yeah.
How do we break out of that? And it is striking that we've had a few long-serving chancellors, and I do think, to be fair, you need a chancellor with a long-term tenure and a vision. But maybe Osborne, Brown, and Lawson would be the exceptions over the last sort of 40 years or so. But his road had tax reform, left wing. This isn't a left right wing issue. People like Dan Needle, Labour member, but also someone who's very good on tax, will say you got things like the 100k cut-off cliff, and it sort of penalises you earning over that. So in terms of Reeves, it's a classic 6 of 1 half question, which is that, yes, she's had a difficult inheritance, but she played a bad hand badly.
Sure.
And that is why people can see that as we get further and further away from the last election, and she owns more and more of what's happened since, she owns the responsibility for that. And of course, she had the budget last year. She'll have this budget as well. But there's also things such as stated priorities versus revealed preferences. So things such as she says, growth is my number 1 priority. Well, of course, the obvious answer to that, as we saw, for instance, on the other side, the Tories, the Brexit stuff, hang on a sec, your own government forecast says that this will not boost growth or employment.
And they're doing inconsistent things, right?
On the employment rates,
yeah. Like as I wrote about in last week's magazine, how can you say that you're only doing pro-growth things and then bringing in an employment rights bill, for example,
Paul Johnson on
that your own government, that your own impact assessment is going to say cost businesses £5 billion. But we're going to stop the cameras before we embarrass ourselves. But before we do that, I've got 2 questions. The first is the obvious one. Of all the drinks we've tasted, and I guess the chancellors they represent, which is your favourite?
I think of all of these, I'm not saying I'm sort of... It's a difficult one, isn't it? It's a properly sort of, when I was a Sunday hack, it was a kill your babies thing on a Saturday, which is like you got to slaughter some of your favourites. But I'm going to go for the original. I'm going to go for Dizzy. I'm going to go for Benjamin Disraeli, and I'm going to say that I think that was my favourite one.
Okay, and our final question is, as you said earlier, Steer Pike sadly revealed that Rachel Reeves is not going to be reviving the drinking tradition. She will just be having... It might not even be mineral water. It'd be water out of one of the House of Commons water fountains.
But Eau de Thames, as one person in the cafeteria told me that. Eau de Thames, yeah.
But if we were in a different world where drinking at work was still accepted at places that weren't just Fleet
the
Street,
Spectator,
what do you think the Chancellor's drink would be?
Well, I'm told that her favourite drink is the Aperol Spritz. So of these, I'm not necessarily sure which would grab her. Of these, probably the gin and tonic, maybe the white wine and a bit of Malvern water. But I do think probably a white wine. I think that will be her chosen choice. Sort of the drink of such professionals everywhere.
James Heale, your political and drink history knowledge is genuinely incredibly impressive. So thank you very much for joining Reality Check.
Thank you very much, Michael.